Welcome back to Sleepy History Nights, where we travel through time with stories of power, passion, and the people who shaped our world. Tonight, we journey to ancient Egypt, not to the time of the pyramids, but to the final chapter of pharaonic rule. When one woman stood against the might of Rome, wielding intelligence as her greatest weapon. Her name was Cleopatra VII, Philip, the last active pharaoh of Egypt, and her story is far more complex than Hollywood would have you believe. Before we begin, if you enjoy these journeys through history, please take a moment to subscribe to Sleepy History Nights, leave a like, and settle in. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let this story of ancient ambition and tragic destiny carry you gently into the night. It was the year 69 BC. In the city of Alexandria, one of the greatest centers of learning, culture, and commerce in the ancient world. In the royal palace, a daughter was born to Ptolemy XII, Ides, the reigning pharaoh of Egypt. They named her Cleopatra, after her mother and grandmother. Before her, her name that meant glory of her father in Greek. Yes, Greek, not Egyptian, because the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt was not native Egyptian at all. They were Macedonian Greeks, descendants of Ptolemy, the first Soter, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals. When Alexander died suddenly in 323 BC at the age of 32, his vast empire was carved up among his generals. Ptolemy claimed Egypt, and his descendants had ruled it ever since for nearly 300 years by the time Cleopatra was born. But those 3 centuries had taken their toll. The Ptolemaic dynasty was infamous for its internal violence and dysfunction. Brothers murdered sisters, mothers poisoned sons. Families went to war with themselves over succession. It was a tradition of survival through ruthlessness, and Cleopatra was born into its final, desperate generation. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was called Ides, the flute player, sometimes as a compliment to his love of music, more often as mockery of his weakness as a ruler. Egypt under Ides was a shadow of its former glory. The kingdom was heavily in debt to Rome, which had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. Rome had grown from a city-state into an empire, conquering territory after territory, absorbing kingdoms into its ever-expanding domain. Egypt remained technically independent, but everyone knew the truth. It survived only because Rome allowed it to survive for now. Ptolemy XII maintained his throne through massive bribes to Roman politicians, borrowing enormous sums of money to pay for Rome's friendship. The Egyptian people despised him for it. They saw their pharaoh not as a divine ruler, but as a puppet, selling their kingdom piece by piece to foreign powers. In 58 BC, when Cleopatra was about 11 years old, her father was driven from the throne by a popular uprising. He fled to Rome, leaving Egypt in chaos, leaving his children behind. Cleopatra and her siblings, there were at least 5 of them, maybe more, remained in Alexandria under the guardianship of regents, while their father groveled before Roman senators, begging for military intervention to restore his throne. It took 3 years. 3 years of political maneuvering, more bribes, and finally Roman military force before Ptolemy XII was reinstalled as pharaoh in 55 BC, but he returned a broken man, even more subservient to Rome, even more hated by his people. He ruled for another 4 years before dying in 51 BC, leaving behind a kingdom drowning in debt, political instability, and the looming shadow of Roman annexation. According to his will approved by Rome, of course the throne would pass to his eldest surviving children, Cleopatra, now 18 years old, and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was only 10. They were to rule together as co-regents, and according to Ptolemaic tradition, they were to marry each other. This wasn't unusual in the Ptolemaic dynasty. For 300 years, brothers had married sisters to keep power within the family and maintain the claim of pure royal blood. But Cleopatra had no intention of sharing power with a child. From the beginning, she acted as the sole ruler of Egypt, sidelining her young brother and the advisors who controlled him. She issued coins with only her image. She signed documents in her name alone. She presented herself not as co-regent, but as Pharaoh in her own right. Cleopatra was extraordinarily well educated, perhaps the most educated ruler of her time. The Ptolemaic court valued scholarship, and Alexandria was home to the legendary Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world. Cleopatra studied there, absorbing philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature. But her most remarkable talent was languages. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years to actually learn Egyptian, the language of the people she ruled. All her predecessors had spoken only Greek, governing Egypt as foreign occupiers who happened to wear pharaoh's crowns. But Cleopatra could speak Egyptian, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Ethiopian, and several other languages, ancient writers claimed. She could converse with ambassadors and merchants from across the known world without needing a translator. This wasn't just impressive, it was strategic. Language gave her power, the ability to communicate directly, to charm, to persuade, to understand what others were saying when they thought she couldn't hear. But linguistic skill and education couldn't solve the fundamental problem she faced. Egypt was broke. The Nile, which had always been Egypt's life force, had experienced several years of low flooding. Poor floods meant poor harvests. Poor harvests meant famine, unrest, and economic collapse. Meanwhile, the kingdom's debt to Rome continued to grow, and Ptolemy XIII's advisors, particularly a eunuch named Pathinus and a tutor named Theodotus, were working against her. They whispered to the young pharaoh that his sister was trying to steal his throne, that he was the rightful ruler, that she was dangerous and needed to be removed. By 49 BC, barely 2 years into her reign, Cleopatra faced a coup. Her brother's advisors marshaled military support, turned the Egyptian court against her, and forced her to flee Alexandria. At 20 years old, Cleopatra found herself in exile, driven into the eastern desert toward the border with Syria, with only a small group of loyal followers. She could have given up, accepted defeat, lived out her life in comfortable obscurity somewhere far from Egypt. But Cleopatra was a survivor, and she was already planning her return. While Cleopatra was in exile, Rome itself was tearing apart. Julius Caesar and Pompey, the great two of the most powerful men in Rome, had gone to war against each other in a brutal civil conflict for control of the Republic. Caesar, the brilliant general and politician, had crossed the Rubicon River with his legions, an act of war against the Roman Senate. Pompey, backed by the Senate, gathered his forces to oppose him. The two armies clashed across the Mediterranean in a series of battles that would determine the future of Rome. In August of 48 BC, the decisive battle occurred at Pharsalus in Greece. Caesar's forces crushed Pompey's army. Pompey fled, desperate, looking for sanctuary somewhere Caesar couldn't reach him, and he made what would prove to be a fatal decision. He sailed to Egypt, hoping to find refuge with Ptolemy XIII, whom Pompey had helped restore to power years earlier. He expected gratitude, protection, maybe even military support. Instead, Ptolemy's advisors saw an opportunity. If they killed Pompey and presented his head to Caesar, perhaps they would win Rome's favor. Perhaps Caesar would confirm Ptolemy XIII as the sole legitimate ruler of Egypt and forget about Cleopatra entirely. So when Pompey's ship arrived off the coast of Alexandria, they sent a small boat to greet him. Pompey stepped aboard, thinking he was being escorted to safety. Instead, they murdered him, stabbed him to death as his wife watched in horror from the ship. They cut off his head and preserved it to present as a gift to Caesar. A few days later, Caesar arrived in Alexandria, pursuing Pompey, expecting to find his rival and perhaps capture him. Instead, he was presented with Pompey's severed head and signet ring. Caesar wept whether from genuine grief or political theatre is impossible to know. Pompey had been his son-in-law, his former ally, and even his enemies. There had been respect between them. But more importantly, Pompey's murder was an insult. Caesar believed that only he had the right to decide Pompey's fate. Ptolemy's advisors had overstepped, presuming to interfere in Roman affairs. Caesar established himself in the royal palace of Alexandria, declaring that he would arbitrate the dispute between Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra, essentially taking control of Egypt under the pretense of settling a family squabble. This was Cleopatra's moment. She was still in exile, still technically barred from Alexandria, but she knew that Caesar, pragmatic, brilliant, hungry for power, was her chance to reclaim the throne. She just had to find a way to meet him. The problem was that the palace was heavily guarded, and Ptolemy's forces controlled the city. If Cleopatra tried to enter Alexandria openly, she would be arrested or killed before she reached Caesar. So she devised a plan that was risky, dramatic, and brilliant. She traveled by boat at night, crossing the harbor waters in secret. With her was one trusted servant, a Sicilian named Apollo. They brought a large bundle of accounts, vary on exactly what it was. Some say it was a carpet. Others claim it was a linen sack used for bedding. Whatever the container, Cleopatra climbed inside, and Apollodorus rolled or tied it shut, then carried it on his back. He walked through the palace gates as if delivering goods, past guards who saw only a servant with a bundle, not a queen in hiding. He was brought to Caesar's private quarters, and there, in front of Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in the world, Apollodorus unrolled the bundle. Cleopatra emerged. Imagine the scene. Caesar, 52 years old, veteran of countless political intrigues and military campaigns, expecting a quiet evening in his commandeered palace. And suddenly, a young woman, 21 years old, dramatically appearing from hiding, composed, fearless, speaking to him in flawless Latin, not begging for mercy, not groveling, presenting herself as the rightful queen of Egypt and proposing an alliance. Ancient historians wrote that Caesar was captivated not just by her appearance. Accounts suggest she was striking rather than classically beautiful, but by her intelligence, her audacity, her presence. This was not a helpless exile begging for rescue. This was a political mind recognizing another political mind and proposing a partnership. Caesar needed Egypt's wealth to fund his ambitions in Rome. Cleopatra needed Caesar's military power to reclaim her throne. By the end of that first night, they had formed an alliance, and perhaps, according to rumor and later historical accounts, they had become lovers. Whether their relationship began immediately or developed over time, it would shape the fates of both Egypt and Rome for years to come. But first, there was a war to fight. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors were not going to surrender power peacefully. When they learned that Cleopatra had reached Caesar, they prepared for conflict. The Alexandrian War was about to begin. The Alexandrian War began almost immediately after Cleopatra's dramatic arrival at the palace. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors Pothinus, Theodotus, and the general Achilles realized they had lost control of the situation. Caesar, the most powerful Roman in the world, had chosen to support Cleopatra over Ptolemy, and they knew what that meant for their own survival. So they mobilized the Egyptian army, trapped Caesar and Cleopatra inside the royal palace complex, and laid siege. What followed was months of brutal urban warfare in the streets of Alexandria. Caesar had only a few thousand Roman legionaries, with him a small personal guard, not an invasion force. The Egyptian army numbered in the tens of thousands, but Caesar was one of the greatest military minds in history, and he turned the palace into a fortress, using every tactical advantage he could find. The fighting was chaotic and destructive. At one point, to prevent the Egyptian fleet from being used against him, Caesar ordered his men to set fire to the ships in the harbor. The fire spread out of control, reaching the docks in nearby warehouses. Legend says that part of the famous Library of Alexandria burned in this fire, thousands of irreplaceable scrolls and texts consumed by flames meant for warships. Whether this is true or exaggerated, the symbolism was devastating. The glory of Ptolemaic Egypt literally burning while foreigners fought over its throne. The siege lasted for months. Caesar sent urgent messages to his allies in Syria and Asia Minor, calling for reinforcements. Cleopatra remained by his side throughout, trapped inside the palace, her fate now inextricably linked to his. If Caesar fell, she would be captured and executed. If he triumphed, she would be queen. Finally, in March of 47 BC, Roman reinforcements arrived. Caesar broke out of the palace. He joined his fresh troops and met Ptolemy's army in open battle near the Nile Delta. The battle was swift and decisive. The Egyptian forces, despite their numbers, couldn't withstand the disciplined Roman legions. They broke and fled. Ptolemy XIII himself drowned in the Nile, trying to escape across the river in heavy ceremonial armor that dragged him down into the water. His body was recovered days later, bloated and unrecognizable except for his golden armor. At 22 years old, Cleopatra was once again the ruler of Egypt, this time with no rivals, no co-regents, and the full backing of Rome's greatest general. According to Ptolemaic tradition and to maintain a pretense of legitimacy, Cleopatra still needed a ruler, so she married her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV, who was about 12 years old. Like Ptolemy XIII before him, he was pharaoh in name only. The real power belonged to Cleopatra. But more significantly, Cleopatra was pregnant. In the summer of 47 BC, she gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy, the 15th Philopator Philometor Caesar officially Ptolemy, but everyone called him by his nickname, Caesarion, Little Caesar. Caesar himself never publicly acknowledged the boy as his son, but he never denied it either. For Cleopatra, the child was both a personal bond to Caesar and a political statement. If Caesarion was Caesar's son, he linked the Ptolemaic dynasty to Rome's most powerful family. He could, potentially, inherit both Egypt and Rome, uniting the two greatest powers of the Mediterranean world under a single ruler. It was an audacious dream, and Cleopatra was positioning herself and her son to make it reality. After the Alexandrian War ended, Caesar remained in Egypt for several more months, far longer than any military necessity required. He and Cleopatra traveled up the Nile on a massive ceremonial barge, visiting temples, being celebrated as divine rulers. It was both a romantic interlude and a political tour, showing Egypt and the world that Cleopatra ruled with Caesar's blessing. But eventually, Caesar had to return to Rome. His civil war wasn't truly over. Pompey's sons and allies still fought on in North Africa and Spain. The Roman Senate was fractious and suspicious, and Caesar had ambitions that required his presence in Rome. Before he left, he ensured that Cleopatra's position was secure, leaving Roman troops garrisoned in Alexandria, making clear to any potential rivals that Egypt was under his protection. Cleopatra remained in Alexandria, ruling Egypt, raising her son, and waiting. And then, in 46 BC, Caesar invited her to Rome. It was an unprecedented honor. Foreign monarchs occasionally visited Rome, but they came as suppliants or hostages, not as equals. Cleopatra arrived with a full royal entourage, with Caesarion, and was housed in Caesar's villa across the Tiber River. Her presence in Rome caused a scandal. Caesar was already married to a Roman woman named Calpurnia. Roman law forbade bigamy, and Romans were deeply suspicious of Eastern monarch, especially a woman who ruled in her own right. The conservative senators muttered about Caesar's ambitions, his Eastern mistress, his possible plans to become king. And king was a word Romans despised. They had overthrown their kings 5 centuries earlier and prided themselves on being a republic. But Caesar didn't seem to care about the rumors. He even had a golden statue of Cleopatra placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the goddess from whom Caesar's family claimed descent. It was an astonishing gesture, linking Cleopatra to Rome's divine mythology, suggesting she was more than just a foreign queen. Cleopatra remained in Rome for nearly 2 years, observing Roman politics, meeting senators and generals, making alliances. She was there on the Ides of March, 44 BC, the day Julius Caesar was assassinated. Caesar had been increasingly acting like a king in all but name. He accepted the title of Dictator Perpetua, dictator for life. He wore purple robes and a laurel crown. He had his image placed on coins while still living, something previously reserved for dead heroes or gods. A group of senators, calling themselves the Liberators, decided he had to die. On March 15, 44 BC, they surrounded him in the theater of Pompey during a Senate meeting. 23 knife wounds. Caesar collapsed at the foot of a statue of Pompey, his former ally, former enemy, the man whose murder in Egypt had brought him and Cleopatra together. Rome erupted into chaos. Cleopatra was still in the city, suddenly in terrible danger. Her protector was dead. Her son was potentially a target. Caesarion, as Caesar's possible heir, represented a threat to anyone vying for power. She fled Rome immediately, sailing back to Egypt with her entourage, uncertain what would happen next. When she reached Alexandria, she learned that her nominal co-ruler, her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, had died suddenly. Ancient sources hint that she may have had him poised, removing any potential rival and making Caesarion her official co-regent. At 3 years old, Caesarion became Ptolemy XV, Pharaoh of Egypt, alongside his mother. But Egypt's future depended on what happened in Rome. Caesar's assassins and his supporters were now at war, fighting for control of the Roman world. The main players were Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew, and adopted heir Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and friend. Initially, Octavian and Antony were rivals, nearly going to war with each other. But they realized they were stronger together, at least for now. They formed a second triumvirate, with another general, Lepidus, 3 men ruling Rome jointly, hunting down Caesar's assassins. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, Antony and Octavian crushed the assassins' forces. Brutus and Cassius, the leaders of the conspiracy, both died. Brutus by suicide after his defeat. With the assassins dead, Antony and Octavian divided the Roman world between them. Octavian would govern the western provinces from Rome, Antony would govern the East from wherever he chose to base himself, and the East included Egypt. In 41 BC, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, a city in what is now southern Turkey. He wanted to ensure Egypt's loyalty, to discuss tribute payments, and possibly to investigate whether Cleopatra had secretly supported Caesar's assassins. Cleopatra knew this meeting would determine Egypt's fate, and she knew that Antony, like Caesar before him, was a man who could be influenced, charmed, and perhaps seduced into alliance. So she prepared to make an entrance that would be remembered for centuries. Cleopatra arrived at Tarsus by sailing up the river Kidnus on a magnificent barge. The ship itself was a work of art, gilded stern, purple sails perfumed with rare oils, silver oars that kept time with music from flutes and harps. Cleopatra reclined under a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Beautiful young attendants, dressed as nymphs and cupids, stood around her, fanning her with peacock feathers. The air was thick with incense and perfume. As the barge approached, crowds gathered on the riverbanks, staring in wonder. Word spread through the city. The Queen of Egypt had arrived, and she looked like a goddess descending from myth. Even Antony, waiting in the city's forum to receive her formally, found himself alone. His audience had abandoned him to watch Cleopatra's arrival. She sent him a message. She would be honored if he would join her for dinner aboard her ship. It was a calculated reversal. Antony had summoned her, but she was dictating the terms of their meeting. When Antony came aboard, he found a feast of impossible luxury. The entire ship was illuminated with so many lights, it turned night into day. The food was exotic and abundant. The entertainment was lavish. Everything designed to impress, to overwhelm, to demonstrate that Egypt's wealth and sophistication far exceeded anything Rome could offer. Antony was captivated. Mark Antony was different from Caesar. Where Caesar had been calculating and intellectual, Antony was emotional and impulsive. He was a brilliant general, a brave soldier, beloved by his troops. But he was also known for his appetites, for wine, for pleasure, for living in the moment rather than planning 10 steps ahead. Cleopatra recognized this immediately. She matched his energy, his love of spectacle, his desire for pleasure and adventure. The next night, Antony hosted a banquet for her, trying to match her extravagance. Cleopatra attended, smiled politely, and openly mocked the simplicity of his preparations compared to hers. Then, according to legend, she removed one of the massive pearl earrings. She wore pearls so large and valuable they were among the most expensive objects in the world. She dropped the pearl into a cup of vinegar, waited for it to dissolve, and drank it. It was pure theater, demonstrating that she could casually consume wealth that would bankrupt entire kingdoms. Antony was enchanted. By the end of their meetings he had agreed to far more than just a political alliance. He would spend the winter in Alexandria with Cleopatra, leaving his duties in the East largely unattended. They formed what they called the Inimitable Livers, a society dedicated to pleasure, luxury, and living life without restraint. They held lavish banquets every night, competing to outdo each other in extravagance. They dressed as common people and wandered Alexandria's streets at night, playing pranks. They hunted, gambled, drank, and celebrated with an intensity that scandalized more conservative Romans. But beneath the pleasure-seeking was serious politics. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his military campaigns. Cleopatra needed Antony's protection and his recognition of her authority and of her children's legitimacy. Because Cleopatra was pregnant again. In 40 BC, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, whom she named Alexander, Helios' son, and Cleopatra's Selene moon. Antony acknowledged them as his children, something Caesar had never done publicly with Caesar. For a time, everything seemed perfect for Cleopatra. She had the support of Rome's most powerful Eastern general. She had 3 children, 2 of whom had a Roman father of the highest rank. Egypt was prosperous and secure, but empires are never stable for long, and Antony's alliance with Octavian was already beginning to fracture. Antony and Octavian maintained an uneasy partnership for several years, but the tensions were always there. Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavian, in a political alliance meant to bind the 2 men together, but he kept returning to Cleopatra in Alexandria. In 37 BC, he officially recognized his children with Cleopatra and gave them royal titles, calling them kings and queens of various eastern territories. In 34 BC, after a successful military campaign, Antony held a massive ceremony in Alexandria called the Donations of Alexander. It was a deliberate echo of Alexander the Great, the conqueror who had founded the city centuries earlier. In front of a vast crowd, seated on golden thrones, Antony and Cleopatra distributed territories across the eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra was declared Queen of Kings. Caesarion was named King of Kings, and recognized as Caesar's son and rightful heir to Rome. The twins and Antony's younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, were given kingdoms of their own. It was essentially a coronation, Cleopatra presenting herself and her family as the rightful rulers of the East, and Antony, a Roman general, was legitimizing this new Eastern dynasty. In Rome, Octavian saw his opportunity. He began a propaganda campaign portraying Antony as a traitor who had abandoned Rome for an Egyptian seductress. The Roman Senate, under Octavian's influence, stripped Antony of his powers and declared war not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. It was clever politics. Octavian framed the conflict as Rome defending itself against a foreign queen who threatened Roman values and freedom. He painted Cleopatra as a scheming Eastern temptress who had corrupted a good Roman general. The truth was more complex. This was a civil war between 2 Roman factions, but Octavian had found a way to make it look like a war of civilization against barbarism. In 31 BC, the 2 forces met in a naval battle off the coast of Actium in Greece. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a fleet of Egyptian and Roman ships, large, heavy vessels built for power. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, was smaller and more maneuverable. The battle was confused and chaotic. Accounts differ on exactly what happened, but at a crucial moment, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships suddenly broke formation and sailed away from the battle, heading for open sea. Antony, seeing Cleopatra leave, abandoned his own flagship, transferred to a smaller vessel, and followed her. His fleet, left without its commander, surrendered or was destroyed. The Battle of Actium was over. Octavian had won. Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Alexandria, knowing what was coming. Octavian would pursue them. There would be no negotiation, no peace. This would end only one way. The final act of Cleopatra's life was about to begin. After the disaster at Actium, Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria knowing their time was running out. Octavian was coming. His legions were marching through the eastern provinces, sweeping aside whatever resistance remained. It was only a matter of months, perhaps weeks, before he reached Egypt. But Cleopatra refused to accept defeat without trying every possible strategy. She attempted diplomatic negotiations, sending messages to Octavian, offering concessions, trying to find some arrangement that would preserve Egypt's independence, or at least her children's lives. Octavian's responses were cold and calculating. He sent private messages to Cleopatra, hinting that if she betrayed Antony, she had him killed and surrendered. Egypt peacefully, he might be willing to let her remain as a client queen under Roman supervision. But Cleopatra understood what those promises were worth. Octavian had no interest in allowing a rival dynasty to continue. He wanted Egypt's wealth, its grain, its strategic position, and he wanted to eliminate any threat to his own power. Antony fell into a deep depression. The man who had been Caesar's right hand, who had commanded legions, who had held the eastern half of the Roman world, he now saw himself as a failure. His fleet was destroyed. His soldiers were deserting. His alliance with Cleopatra had cost him everything. He withdrew from public life, spending his days in isolation, drinking, contemplating suicide. Cleopatra tried to rally him, but the man she had known confident, charismatic, larger than life was crumbling. Meanwhile, she began preparing for the worst. She had a mausoleum built, a tomb monument near the Temple of Isis, designed to be her final resting place and a treasure vault for Egypt's remaining wealth. She moved gold, silver, precious stones, ebony, ivory, pearls, and irreplaceable artifacts into the mausoleum. Ostensibly, this was to protect Egypt's treasures from looting, but Cleopatra may have had another plan. If Octavian wanted Egypt's wealth, she could threaten to burn it all to destroy the treasures and riches that made Egypt worth conquering. It was leverage, desperate leverage, but perhaps the only card she had left to play. In the summer of 30 BC, Octavian's forces reached the borders of Egypt. Antony tried one last military defense, leading his remaining troops out to meet the invasion. But his men betrayed him. His cavalry defected to Octavian. His infantry refused to fight. One by one, his forces melted away, joining the winning side, leaving Antony alone with his defeat. Antony returned to Alexandria in despair. And then someone, a servant perhaps, or someone with confused information, brought him devastating news. Cleopatra was dead. She had killed herself, they said, sealed herself in a mausoleum and taken her own life. Antony, already broken, saw no reason to continue living. If Cleopatra was dead, if Egypt was lost, if his honor and career were destroyed, what was left? Following the Roman tradition of honorable suicide, he asked his servant Eros to help him die. Eros, unable to kill the general he loved, instead turned the sword on himself and died. Antony, seeing this final act of loyalty, picked up his own sword and fell upon it, driving the blade into his abdomen. But he didn't die immediately. Suicide by sword was unreliable of him, causing a slow, agonizing death rather than a quick end. Antony lay bleeding, in terrible pain, waiting for death. And then word came that the initial report was wrong. Cleopatra wasn't dead. She had locked herself inside a mausoleum with a few trusted servants, perhaps, spreading the rumor of her death intentionally to see what Antony or Octavian would do. Or perhaps the rumor had been an accident, a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. When Cleopatra learned that Antony had stabbed himself believing she was dead, she sent messengers to bring him to her. Servants carried the dying Antony through Alexandria's streets to the mausoleum. But Cleopatra, fearing a trap, refused to open the sealed doors. Instead, servants hauled Antony up the outside of the building using ropes, pulling him through a window on the upper floor. Imagine that scene. Cleopatra, who had captivated Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, who had ruled Egypt for 2 decades, now dragging her dying lover through a window, his blood staining the stone walls of her tomb. Antony died in her arms, inside the mausoleum that was meant to be her monument. According to Plutarch, his final words were simple. He told her not to grieve, but to remember him as he had been in his glory, when he was the most powerful Roman in the East. Cleopatra was now alone. Antony was dead. Her alliance with Rome was shattered. Octavian's army was at the gates of Alexandria, and she still had one final negotiation to attempt. Octavian entered Alexandria without opposition. The city surrendered. There was no point in resisting. Rome had won, completely and finally. Octavian sent an officer named Cornelius Gallus to secure Cleopatra. He wanted her alive, not out of mercy, but because he had plans for her. Roman generals traditionally celebrated military victories with triumphs, elaborate parades through Rome where they displayed their conquests, their treasures, and their captive enemies. Octavian wanted to march Cleopatra through Rome in chains, a living symbol of Egypt's defeat and his own glory. He wanted the Roman people to see the foreign queen who had seduced two great Romans and nearly destroyed the Republic, now brought low and humiliated. Cleopatra understood this immediately. She agreed to meet with Octavian's representatives to negotiate, to discuss terms. But she was buying time, trying to understand her options. She remained barricaded in her mausoleum with two of her most loyal servants, Ceres and Charmian, women who had served her for years. Octavian visited her himself, coming to the mausoleum to speak with her. Ancient sources describe their meeting as a strange negotiation. Cleopatra, 39 years old now, exhausted, grieving, but still sharp and calculating. Octavian, 33, coldly pragmatic, interested only in securing his victory and eliminating any threats. She tried to charm him, to appeal to his reason, to negotiate some arrangement that would preserve her children's lives, if not her own. Octavian made vague promises, saying the right things, committing to nothing. Cleopatra had spent her entire life reading people, manipulating power dynamics, surviving in a world that wanted to destroy her. She knew Octavian was lying. She knew she would be taken to Rome, paraded as a prisoner, and then probably executed or left to live in humiliating captivity. And she knew her children would never be safe as long as they represented potential threats to Octavian's power. Caesarion especially was in terrible danger. He was 16 years old now, officially recognized as Julius Caesar's son. As long as he lived, he was a rival claimant to Caesar's legacy, something Octavian, who had built his entire political career on being Caesar's adopted heir, could never tolerate. Cleopatra sent Caesarion away, fleeing south, toward Ethiopia or India, anywhere far from Rome's reach. But Octavian's agents tracked him down. Caesarion was captured and executed on Octavian's orders. The official line was that 2 Caesars are too many, a death sentence disguised as political wisdom. Cleopatra may not have known about Caesarion's death in her final days, or perhaps she suspected it. Either way, she understood that her time had run out. She made one final request to Octavian's guards. She asked to be allowed to visit Antony's tomb, to make offerings and say her farewells. He was granted a small mercy, or perhaps just indifference. Cleopatra went to Antony's burial place, accompanied by Ceres and Charmian. She poured libations, made prayers, and according to Plutarch, spoke to Antony's spirit, telling him that she would soon join him. Then she returned to her chambers in the mausoleum. What happened next is one of history's most famous mysteries. Cleopatra sent a sealed message to Octavian, requesting that she be buried alongside Antony. Then she dismissed most of her attendants, keeping only Ceres and Charmian with her. She bathed, dressed in her royal regalia, and prepared a final meal. Accounts say that a servant brought a basket of figs from the countryside. The guards inspected it casually and let it through. Hidden beneath the fig sow, the story goes, was a small, venomous snake, an asp, some sources call it, though the exact species is debated. What's more likely is an Egyptian cobra, a snake that was sacred to Egyptian gods and associated with royalty. Pharaohs wore cobra symbols on their crowns, the urizas, a sign of divine authority and protection. Dying by cobra bite would have been, in Egyptian tradition, a transformation into the divine, not mere suicide. When Octavian received Cleopatra's letter and understood its meaning, he sent guards rushing to her chambers. They broke through the doors and found her dead, lying on a golden couch, dressed in her royal robes. Ides was already dead at her feet. Charmian was dying, barely conscious, trying to adjust the royal diadem on Cleopatra's head, arranging her mistress properly even in death. One of the guards asked, "Was this well done of your lady?" Charmian's last words, according to Plutarch, were, "It is well done, and fitting for a princess descended of so many royal kings." Then she died. Octavian's guards found no snake. They searched the room thoroughly, looking for evidence of what had killed the three women. Some claimed to see 2 small puncture wounds on Cleopatra's arm. Others said there were no marks at all. The truth of how Cleopatra died remains uncertain. Perhaps it was a snake. Perhaps she used poison. Egypt had sophisticated knowledge of toxins, and Cleopatra had reportedly been experimenting with various deadly substances. Perhaps the snake story was a later invention, a dramatic detail added to an already legendary death. What matters is that Cleopatra chose how she died. She refused to be paraded through Rome in chains. She refused to give Octavian the spectacle he wanted. She died as she had lived on her own terms, outmaneuvering her enemies one final time. Octavian, despite being denied his triumph, honored her request. Cleopatra was buried alongside Mark Antony in a tomb somewhere in Alexandria. The exact location has been lost to history. Centuries of earthquakes, urban development, and rising sea levels have buried or destroyed most of ancient Alexandria. Despite numerous archaeological searches, Cleopatra's tomb has never been found. Perhaps it's still there, waiting beneath the modern city. Or perhaps it was lost centuries ago to the Mediterranean Sea. Cleopatra VII Philopator was the last active pharaoh of Egypt. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended after nearly 300 years. Egypt became a Roman province, its wealth flowing to Rome, its independence erased. Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, the first Roman emperor, took control of Egypt personally. It was too valuable, too strategically important to be governed like other provinces. Egypt became the emperor's private property, a source of grain that fed Rome's million citizens. As for Cleopatra's surviving children, their fates varied. Caesarion, as we know, was executed. But the 3 younger children, the twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and young Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome. They were raised by Antony's widow, Octavia, who showed them unexpected kindness despite everything. Cleopatra Selene, Cleopatra's daughter, eventually married King Juba II of Mauritania and became a queen in her own right, ruling in North Africa and keeping her mother's memory alive. But the other children disappeared from history. Their fates are unknown. As for Cleopatra's reputation, Rome worked hard to destroy it. Octavian commissioned propaganda portraying her as a dangerous seductress, a foreign threat, a woman who used her sexuality to corrupt good Roman men and nearly destroy the Republic. Roman poets and historians, writing under emperors who owed their power to Octavian's victory, repeated these themes. Cleopatra became a symbol of Eastern decadence, of the dangers of allowing women power, of everything Rome defined itself against. But the real Cleopatra was far more complex. She was one of the most educated rulers of the ancient world, fluent in 9 languages, a patron of scholars and scientists. She ruled Egypt for 21 years, navigating impossible political situations, keeping her kingdom independent longer than anyone thought possible. She wasn't perfect. She was ruthless when necessary, eliminating rivals, including family members. But she was fighting for survival in a world that wanted to destroy her simply for existing as a powerful woman outside Roman control. In the end, she lost, but she made Rome work desperately hard for that victory, and she refused to surrender her dignity even in defeat. 2,000 years later, her name is still known. People still wonder about her tomb, her life, the truth behind the legends. Meanwhile, most of the men who conquered her, the Roman generals and senators, who saw her as nothing but a prize to be claimed or an enemy to be eliminated, are forgotten. Their names lost to history or remembered only because of their connection to her. Perhaps that's its own kind of victory. Thank you for joining us tonight on this journey through the life of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the queen who stood against Rome, the woman whose story has captivated the world for millennia. If this story moved you, if it helped carry you through the night, please take a moment to subscribe to Sleepy History Nights, leave a like, and let us know in the comments which historical figure you'd like to hear about next. There are so many stories waiting to be told, tales of power and passion, of triumph and tragedy, of people who shaped our world and deserve to be remembered. Until next time, rest well, dream of ancient palaces and distant empires, and remember that history is written by the survivors, but legends are created by those who refuse to be forgotten. Good night, travelers through time. Good night, dreamers of ancient worlds. Good night, everyone seeking to understand the complicated, fascinating people who came before us. Sleep well.